23 episodes in, and we are not slowing down anytime soon. This is the Connect the Dots NYC podcast, and honestly, we're just getting warmed up. Let's dive in. Today, I interviewed someone with over 2 decades of experience in homelessness strategy, systems design, and policy. So without further ado, thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Andrew Hening is a social sector strategist, systems thinker, and consultant focused on solving complex public challenges, especially homelessness. He's a UC Berkeley MBA and has spent nearly 2 decades working across government, nonprofits, and cross-sector coalitions. Andrew previously served as Chief Strategy Officer for the Regional Task Force on Homelessness in San Diego and co-founded Opening Doors Marin, where he helped drive measurable reductions in chronic and unsheltered homelessness. His work has included leading large-scale financial planning efforts, supporting the creation of supportive housing, and helping public agencies redesign how their systems operate. He currently lectures at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, teaching systems, thinking, and strategy, and is the author of So You Want to Solve Homelessness? Start Here. Thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew Hening.
Hey, thanks, Madan. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
No problem. Let's get straight into it. So I want to focus on your background and your entry into homelessness work. What first pulled you into working on homelessness rather than another policy or social issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in many ways, I never ever expected to be working on this issue, and I certainly didn't expect to work on it for the last 16 years. So, when I graduated from college back in 2008, I really at that time and growing up imagined that I was on this path to law school and working in the legal sector. That was really kind of my original goal and aspiration. And after I graduated, I moved back to my hometown, Richmond, Virginia. And I was in that kind of limbo period of working at a law firm, studying for the LSAT, applying to law school. And, I'm very grateful for that opportunity because as much as I loved my coworkers and the place where I was employed, I actually slowly but surely and unexpectedly realized, this isn't quite for me. I don't think the actual day-to-day of being a lawyer, at least the kind of law that we were practicing was what I was kind of destined to do. And it also just so happened that, again, that timing 2008, right? Like I graduated right into the Great Recession. My dad was a carpenter his whole life. He lost his job and never got it back during that period. And also, and I can see all this a lot more clearly in hindsight, my family was also very impacted by addiction when I was growing up. And I think, and with those kind of two things, right, the kind of behavioral health challenges that I witnessed firsthand growing up, and then the economic crisis from the recession, it kind of primed me to do something different. So I started taking off from work and volunteering in different places in Richmond. And I eventually volunteered at something called Project Homeless Connect, which is really like a one-day resource fair that brings together all these different providers into one place to make it easy for people experiencing homelessness to get the services that they need. So I did that, was completely blown away and hooked. It was an incredible experience. And so from then on, I was just like, I think this is what I want to do. And I started looking for different opportunities. I ended up finding AmeriCorps Vista. And with AmeriCorps Vista, unlike kind of regular AmeriCorps, you're actually applying for jobs. And so one of the jobs that I found, ironically enough, or coincidentally enough, was the Project Homeless Connect coordinator position for Santa Clara County, or really Silicon Valley, I think, as we kind of more generally know it. So I kind of begged them for the job and I got it. And despite really no experience other than that one thing, I got the position. And so I drove across the country, 3,000 miles, everything in the truck on my car. And again, that was almost 16 years ago. And here we are. I'm still at it. So that was the gateway all those years ago.
Wow, what a story. I mean, driving across the country is no easy feat, especially to start in an industry that you've had no previous experience in. And so early in your career in this sort of novel industry of homelessness, what surprised you most about how homelessness systems actually function?
What's interesting, and I think it actually kind of drives a little bit with some of the work that you've been doing around homelessness. But I mean, it was really kind of like the core value proposition of Project Homeless Connect, which actually began in San Francisco. And by the time that I had been involved with it, had really spread all over the world. And it's just this notion that, and you're going to hear this probably a lot from me, is that, we really are living through a distinct period of homelessness. I'm a millennial. I was born in the 1980s. I've never known a United States without homelessness. But what we're experiencing today is really not always existed. There have been different episodes or kind of eras of homelessness throughout US history, but really what we're experiencing today began in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And I think what's happened over the last 40, 50 years is that there's just been this organic, natural growth and people trying to help, organizations trying to help, the creation of drop-in centers, the creation of shelters, and all these different programs and services. And, by the early 2000s, after about 20 years of this, it was already apparent that while all of these things are helping and needed, they're often just even physically disjointed and not located next to each other. It's not easy to access them, right? So that was really the premise of Project Homeless Connect, is like, can you bring all of these places under one roof so that someone can actually access all of this in an easy way? And I think now that's even, technology can facilitate that even better. But to me, like, I think that was the big aha, is that people experiencing homelessness are spending huge portions of their day just going from provider to provider to kind of meet their basic needs, and then didn't leave a lot of time to then actually work on the actual resolution of homelessness. And again, this was like, there was no nefarious evil thing going on here. It was just like the nature of the system design is that people had to spend a lot of time doing that. So I think that was like one of the biggest ahas for me in those early years.
And you've led strategic financial audits of over $3 billion in homelessness spending. From your perspective, why is homelessness so difficult for communities to reduce despite these major investments, despite time, despite so many resources being put into this issue?
Well, I would say two things. The first is, and it's interesting because I feel like I've sort of randomly stumbled into this financial niche. After working in direct service. So I did my year with AmeriCorps, and then I spent the next 5 years working in direct services and for a nonprofit, helping people get jobs. I then got my MBA at UC Berkeley, shifted into government, right? Like, so gradually, slowly but surely, like all of those different skills and experiences sort of coalesced into this ability that I'm still trying to learn, of like, how do you actually, in a sense, audit these financial homeless systems of care, and also develop financial projections around what should we be spending as a sector on the solution, right? So we can definitely go into a lot more detail about that. But what I think one of the big things is, like, now it's kind of becoming a little bit of a talking point around, over the last, few years, especially in states like California, where there's been more investment around homelessness. Exactly to your point, right? The public says, look around, like, we've spent billions of dollars and things have barely changed. What's going on? And I think the first big insight is that this is not a static issue, right? Every single day people are resolving their homelessness, and every single day people are becoming homeless for the first time, right? So what often happens is people take the big top line number of some amount of money that's been spent, and they divide by the point in time count, right? So every couple years or every year, communities do this annual point in time count of everyone that's homeless. So people just kind of take the big number and divide by the point in time count, get a per capita figure, and they're like, oh my God, look at all of this waste, right? But it's just one simple example. I'm based in San Diego now. San Diego is one of the biggest systems in the country. At any given moment right now, there's probably about 10,000 people experiencing homelessness in San Diego County. But over the course of a year, another 15,000 people roughly are becoming homeless for the first time. So I think we just have to think about that, right? Unless we address these kind of underlying structural issues that are driving homelessness in the first place, people are going to keep becoming homeless. And thus, even though we're spending resources, more and more people keep falling into the experience. And I think that's one of the big issues of why money is being spent and it's often not yielding the impact that we think it might have.
Yeah, and those point in time counts have definitely come up in previous episodes before, namely with Mark Boychuk, someone who I interviewed last episode, who was dealing with rural homelessness in Alberta. And especially when you have such a small population and such a, not very well connected region, then those point in time counts get even like, sort of worse. And then even with Ian DeYoung, someone I'd interviewed earlier, very vocal about how these point in time counts aren't very, they work, they help, they show how many people are homeless in that point in time. And then you think about all the other points in times, and you start to wonder, what about those other people?
And so I ask you, what do you think are better ways to sort of measure our progress, or lack thereof, in terms of people who are homeless in our communities and our nation? Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm assuming because I think it's kind of a shared frustration among many of us that have worked in this space for a long time that these really are not the best benchmarks. I mean, I think they're pretty universally understood as undercounts, right? It's actually very hard to go out and find everyone on a single morning, even if you have thousands of volunteers that are helping you. I will say though, I do think as long as a point in time count is kind of consistently done in the same way, ideally the undercounts kind of showing up in the same consistent way. So it can sort of serve as a bit of a proxy. And I will say one of the things that I've observed, there are a lot of communities that only do it every other year. I think that's really not great, right? I think at least trying to move more to like an annual kind of cycle helps. So you have a little bit of a better data clip. So I would say that generally about the point in time count while universally agreeing with, many of its flaws. But I think the real evolution of this, and I'm assuming maybe some of your past guests have talked about this, but I'm a huge champion of this, is something called a by name list. So ironically, I'd been working in homeless services for about, I think at that point, 6 or 7 years before even hearing of this concept, even though it was, again, something that kind of emerged back in like the middle, early 2000s or aughts. And the by name list is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a list of all the people experiencing homelessness at a given moment. And there's a big national organization called Community Solutions, and they've really helped kind of popularize this tool and methodology. And you mentioned, earlier, like I had spent a lot of my career working in Marin County, California, which is the suburban community north of San Francisco. So if you imagine the Golden Gate Bridge, it's the other side, right? Like that community. And despite, being a very affluent, progressive community, as recently as 2017, Marin had the seventh highest per capita rate of homelessness in the entire country. So really kind of staggering. And again, I'm happy to unpack, probably what was driving that. But really for our community, and this goes to this kind of core hypothesis or thesis that I have, that the real barrier for the homeless service sector is this kind of lack of coordination, this kind of decentralization, sort of what we were talking about earlier with Project Homeless Connect. So what the by name list does, getting back to your question around data, is it really turns your community from a sort of disjointed collection of different entities into one kind of functional system where everyone's operating off this same shared list of these are all the people experiencing homelessness. And to me, that's really becoming the gold platinum standard for how you can measure data in a consistent way. And there's specific practices that I think make the by name list more or less effective. But where I've really seen it and tried to, through my consulting work over the past few years, like help build on even what Community Solutions has done, is really moving into what I think is a feasible goal of having kind of quarterly action cycles that are really built around updating your by name list every 90 days so that you have more real-time assessments of these are all the people that are homeless today. This is who is in what program. This is who's accountable for them. And that's really how you can drive action and changes, I think, really focusing in that regard.
And I think you mentioned this in regard to Marin County and it being, the seventh largest, or having the seventh most homelessness per capita in the country. What structural or systemic factors led to that, and sort of a tangent to that, what do you think are some of these factors that the public often overlooks that really do drive homelessness?
Well, this was the moment that I went from just kind of being a practitioner in this space to really even understanding what systems were, like what systems thinking is, right? So, I mentioned, I started in Santa Clara County, Project Homeless Connect, then I worked for this nonprofit for about 5 more years after that. So that began in 2010. And then by 2015, 2016, I was at UC Berkeley in graduate school. I thought I was going to kind of stay on this social entrepreneurship track. But there was also this opportunity in Marin at that time, with Marin's biggest city, San Rafael is its name, where they were getting really, really frustrated with homelessness, right? Both objectively, the numbers kept going up. And then qualitatively, the public was getting more and more polarized around the lack of progress, for lack of a better term. And yeah, again, I'm in graduate school and I've been, like working in this space for a number of years at this point. And it was really kind of almost like a rock bottom moment for me where it was like, every single day I'm watching people get jobs. I'm watching them get housed. I'm seeing success, right? So this narrative that we're not helping people is just not true. Yet it is undeniable, right? Like I see things getting worse, right? So it's like, that was really, and I had the great fortune at that time of actually I had this professor who I now co-teach with, Sarah Beckman, who taught this class on complex systems and systems thinking. And it was really my kind of first introduction to like what that even is. And the idea is basically that, systems are these collections of elements or people or components or ideas that tend to organize themselves in a way that they create a consistent pattern of behavior over time, right? And I think one of the problems with systems is that we often inhabit a small corner of a system and we only see kind of our little perspective and we can't see the bigger picture of all of the dynamics that are going on. So to get back to your question, like that was when I really, for the first time, and that really sparked the interest in writing a book, which then took another 5 years to write, is what's driving this? What are those upstream issues that are making homelessness more or less likely? And what I came to find is that, and I think sometimes as a sector, we're guilty of trying to advance a very simple narrative of what's going on. And the reality is it's actually multiple things have been breaking down in parallel over the last, again, 4, 5, 6 decades. So for example, housing is a really big one, right? So Marin County is a very beautiful place, right? There's a huge amount of protected park space. The redwood trees are there, the national seashore, right? Like it's gorgeous. But the result is that 80% of the land in the county, you can't build any housing, right? So like you've dramatically restricted the supply. And then for the land that's left, again, over the last 50, 60 years, we've made it extremely hyper regulated in terms of what can be built. And often those regulations, while well intentioned, are weaponized to actually prevent development, right? So like that's one whole lane there, right? A second one is that, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, the behavioral health system in our country has been dramatically rolled back, right? And so, if you think back to the 50s, for example, there were state hospitals and things like that for people that had severe mental health issues. I'm not recommending we go back to that, but basically in the closing of that system and that shutting down of that system, there was never a comparable thing created, right? So in California, like a lot of the country, if the number of beds that were available, let's just say in that kind of hospital system, had kept pace with population growth, right, over the last 60 or 70 years, we now have 6% of the capacity of what we would have had if those beds had stayed and kept growing with population, right? That's how dramatically the behavioral health system has been pulled back for people that have, again, schizophrenia or serious mental health issues. So those are just two examples. I could list, 7 or 8 more, but it's all of those things coming together that have made homelessness so much more dramatic over the last couple of decades. And Marin just happens to have many of those conditions there, right? Just like most of coastal California or other big metropolitan areas.
Yeah, and obviously, like you had mentioned, progress is being made. I mean, you had mentioned the sort of firsthand experience of seeing people given housing. People are getting jobs, even here in Manhattan. I know people who are being housed, who are coming out of their circumstances. But sort of the unfortunate truth that I think one has to realize is that there are more people now going into homelessness than or that's at a faster rate than we can take people out of homelessness, and that's what's driving these numbers up. And that's why when we see these numbers like $3 billion being spent here, and X% of whatever funding was given to this nonprofit to help homelessness, it is helpful, because without that, then our rate of taking people out would be zero. But it's not enough to compete with the sort of rate at which people are going into homelessness. And so, do you think there are any sort of strategic mistakes or developments that need to be made to change this, such that we can start to combat this at a much more comparable level at which it's being created?
Yeah. What's interesting, and I feel like I'm a little bit of an outlier in this in this space. So again, I appreciate you giving me a platform to share this perspective. But what's really hard is I not in any way dismissive, or I want to minimize like those upstream issues. I mean, that is like the root issue, right? Like if we can fix our nation's kind of affordability crisis, both in terms of, housing cost or increasing wages for kind of regular working people, right? Like that would make a huge dent in the amount of inflow into homelessness, right? You also can think about America's kind of loneliness crisis, right? Like people have fewer friends and fewer family connections, right? And if that can get reversed, then people have more resources when they are in these hard times. So we 100% have to address those underlying issues if we're going to have more success, as a field and as a country. I think where I differ is that I really view the homeless service sector as the emergency room, right? It's almost like this kind of emergency room versus public health issue, right? So public health is really trying to, in this analogy, address those upstream issues, right? They're trying to kind of prevent things from happening in the first place. But the homeless service sector itself, where I've really kind of been the last 16 years, is the crisis has already happened. You've already lost your housing, right? And so to me, like that's really where we have to focus as a sector, because we can't really fundamentally control those other things, right? We have to rely on other partners working on other issues to fix those kind of broken elements. And so when you look at then our systems and what we can control, what I've found again and again is that there's a lot of ways for us to actually become more efficient and more effective in what we do. And I saw that firsthand in Marin as an example, right? Where what we learned, and this is what I think the big aha after, being in that systems class and then trying to apply those lessons as a leader in that system, is what we realized is that, the public was very frustrated about homelessness at that time, like I mentioned, especially in the city where I was working, San Rafael. And they had become really focused, that their kind of hypothesis was that it was this one particular nonprofit in the downtown that had become a magnet effect, right? And you hear this narrative all across the country, right? Like if we just get rid of this provider, then homelessness is going to go away, right? Like that's kind of the thinking. And what we realized is that when we finally assembled all of the players in the system, right? Like the providers, the city, the county, local philanthropy, what we realized is that at the end of the day, there was actually this small group of people, really just a couple dozen, who were actually the ones that were causing this kind of outsized public impact, right? In terms of public intoxication, in terms of, untreated mental illness, or, trash and debris or things like that, right? And from our perspective, this was a humanitarian crisis. Like I still hold to that very firmly, right? Like these are very vulnerable people that need help, but from the public's perspective, it was a little bit more like, okay, this is causing a major disruption to, downtown economic activity or safety or whatever. And I don't think those need to be mutually exclusive, right? I think we can both come to a solution with different motivations. And so what we found though, is when we became very focused on that group, and we didn't even know it at the time, but the term for that is chronic homelessness, right? It's people who've been homeless for more than a year, who have a disabling condition of some kind, whether it be physical health or mental health or traumatic brain injuries, dementia, right? Or sometimes all of these things at the same time. What we realize is that our system, the system that we could control, had not been set up to prioritize those people for the level of help that they needed. And the consequence was that there were people in Marin who had been homeless at that time for 20, 30, 40 years, right? And we knew all of them. We'd been serving them for years, right? We knew them by name, we knew their history, but there was no accountability structure to get them into housing. And that was the fundamental shift that frankly didn't take money. It didn't really take anything other than us organizing around that by name list concept that I mentioned earlier. And once we did that, things dramatically changed, right? In a matter of 2 years, even as the housing market kept getting worse, even as the political environment didn't improve, we had a 28% drop in countywide chronic homelessness. And unsheltered homelessness in San Rafael, where I worked, fell 30%. And so it's left me with this kind of indelible belief that there are always things that we can do, borrowing from what's worked elsewhere, to improve our system performance, even if we're not able to get to the upstream issues yet, we can still make progress in the areas that we can control.
Yeah, and something you just concluded by saying in terms of combining things that have worked elsewhere is something that I've really, really resonated with over my time on this podcast. I mean, I've interviewed, fortunately, so many great people who have done so much good work. And I've heard, like, obviously, everyone has their own and different perspective, but the core is the same, which is that this is an issue that needs to be solved. It's an issue that we're currently solving, sort of after the fact. Like you had mentioned, like the homelessness services right now is like the emergency room. We need to try and be slightly. There needs to be a preventative aspect to this as well, where we have a safety net so that people don't, have to go through homelessness and go through chronic homelessness for 10, 20, as like you mentioned, 40 years. And combining solutions seen all across the country has always been very interesting to me. I mean, I was lucky enough to interview Dr. Zambaris, who sort of created the housing first notion that has successfully spread across the country. However, whenever this topic is brought up of combining sort of forces, I always go back to sort of like the media and the sort of public narrative. Um, and so I want to ask you, how do you think homelessness is currently portrayed in the media, and how do you think that narrative needs to be slightly edited to be, more beneficial for what we're trying to do and for the unification we're trying to create?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. And I think in my mind, it all keeps kind of coming back to this root issue within the homeless service sector itself of this sort of decentralization and lack of alignment, right? Because if we're all splintered doing and saying our own different things, right, it doesn't create a unifying narrative or message. And I think, my impression from having kind of been in this work for a while and seeing the kind of different waves of public support, I really think in the teen, like the late, kind of like, especially into the late teens, there was a lot of support for, the idea of housing first and trying to, help vulnerable people just get back inside and wrap them in supportive services. I think there was a lot of compassion and understanding and frankly, patience for that. And then, I really do feel like the pandemic marked a major shift, especially as there was a major rise in encampments and unsheltered homelessness. And I think for people in the public that might be listening to this or in general, I think there needs to be some compassion on both sides, right? It's like if you're experiencing homelessness, would you really want to go into a congregate shelter with bunk beds, with 80 people in a large room in the middle of a pandemic? No, like you wouldn't do that, right? And on the flip side, though, I think having radical empathy for the public, it's like there is an impact to encampments. There is an impact to large amounts of unsheltered homelessness, right? So basically, I think, both sides have reasons to be frustrated. And I just keep coming back to this kind of optimistic, hopeful center where it's like, no one in the United States is pro homelessness, right? No one wants people to be homeless in our communities. We just differ on the approach. So I think that's kind of number one is I think there's a way always to try to find middle ground. It does feel like we're now in this moment where homelessness is really being sensationalized. I think especially in different social media channels where it's easy to go out and kind of, film or get video of these like really extreme, horrible things that then incite this kind of emotional reaction that everything's a failure and people are, doing really bad things. I think that that's really challenging. And again, where I feel like maybe I'm a little bit different than others in our field is that at some point I feel like you just can't, we as a sector, there's just some kind of emotional truth to that, right? Like I think, if I'm working in a major city and I'm just walking past, people with serious mental health issues or other issues that are homeless every day, like there's no good news story that's going to make me not see that, right? Like there's just an emotional truth of like something is not working, right? So I kind of take the perspective of, as a sector, what is the actual strategy to address that? I think we really need to make unsheltered homelessness, addressing encampments, helping those folks experiencing chronic homelessness. We need to make that a strategic priority for our work, right? Because it has such an outsized impact on public perception. And then if that's the strategy, then I think the media strategy or marketing strategy is how do we then support that strategy, right? Versus just kind of talking to talk. I think that's kind of my perspective. And I certainly have seen ways of how we've done that in the past. But yeah, I think that would be my take on it.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned during your answer was the ability of these different places that obviously all have different homelessness rates, different situations, to deal with homelessness in almost a decentralized way, where we don't have that sort of unification that we're looking for yet, and using the media to not fight for powerful images about homelessness, but rather fight for the sort of unification we need to tackle homelessness as a nation together, rather than having certain groups in the Northeast and then out west and in I don't know, southeast, all tackling it in slightly different ways, but not really meeting together and being one force to tackle this common social issue. Now, on the topic of these different places dealing with homelessness differently, there are communities that have dealt with homelessness successfully, or at least more successful than others, whether that's on an international scale or a national scale within the United States. And so I want to ask you, what do you think makes the communities that have dealt with it, slightly more successfully, whether it's, Marin County that was able to reduce it by, 28%, like you had mentioned, versus other communities that seem to have this sort of ever increasing rate of homelessness?
Yeah, what I've found is, and I've had the chance now of working in at least two communities that have had major drops. Marin is one, and then I also worked in Sonoma County, which is just north of Marin. That actually, according to that same McKinsey study from 2017 that looked at per capita homelessness, Sonoma County had the third highest rate of homelessness in the entire country, right? Like, many people think Sonoma County, vacations, wine country, whatever, right? In fact, it had one of the most major issues around homelessness in the entire country. And then also, I think there's other bright spots like Houston or others that have made a lot of progress. And I'll even give the Houston example because I had a chance. It was about 2 years ago to join this kind of meeting with the former mayor of Houston, who was a big part of like driving that change. And she said something that really struck me, and I think this really is one of the key ingredients. Is that and I'm an endless optimist, so I'm always going to use the language like we can solve homelessness because I really do believe that. But what she said, and I think this is such a great analogy, is in order to solve homelessness, you actually have to get really good at managing homelessness, right? It's almost like a city's public works department, right? Like a public works department, which is responsible for the city's kind of core infrastructure, right? Like it has to have a certain amount of staffing, it has to have a certain amount of equipment, it has to have a certain amount of, all of these ingredients to make sure that the city doesn't crumble and fall apart, right? And one of the big issues with homelessness over the last 40 years, especially our response, is that it seems to just be this like endless year after year kind of ad hoc response, right? Like funding goes up, funding goes down, strategic focus here, strategic focus there, right? Like it's just, we're constantly bouncing from thing to thing to thing versus creating, a clear coordination managerial framework of what's going on, right? So Houston, which again is very similar to what happened in Marin and is very similar to what happened in Sonoma, is that they eventually got a core leadership team, right? Of a few people who were really like, okay, we're going to hold this system together and we're going to bring all the partners together. And what we're going to do with all those partners is really begin to have a shared set of data and facts about what is going on in our system, right? So everyone has the same information, everyone has the same data. And then eventually they also got into the financials, right? They looked at, what is all the money being spent? Where is it going? What programs are serving well? Which ones are not, right? And then it was that kind of core, how do we just manage this better day to day, that has driven a dramatic reduction in homelessness in Houston over the last, decade or longer. And what's unfortunate, and I think I don't really know what this is that I see this a lot in California. When you talk about a place like Houston, those results are often immediately dismissed and chalked up to the fact that Houston and Texas have a different housing and zoning environment, right? Like it's like, well, that's the reason that they've had success. It's not that the system changed and got better. It's that, it's just a fundamentally categorically different place, right? And that's where I really take issue. And I think we as a sector can be better to say, when other communities make progress or set benchmarks or achieve something, what can we learn from that? We should always be trying to learn and triangulate around these kind of innovations, right? Versus trying to find how are we different? How do we dismiss them? And I think that kind of culture of actively seeking out best practices, actively trying to get better, actively trying to learn, that is one of these key ingredients as well, that really drives outsized performance.
And one thing I had learned, I'd interviewed Teresa Shaheen earlier, who is a Yale professor in social entrepreneurship. And she had mentioned that there's sort of three types of entrepreneurship. There's entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, and interpreneurship. And the sort of difference between the sort of glory that one might get of creating something on their own versus, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship, which deal a lot more with taking an already created system and improving, replicating it, doing something that already exists instead of sort of reinventing the wheel. And I do think sometimes in this industry, and I guess just, not to get too philosophical, but in life in general, we do get caught up in trying to be the one who creates everything and be the sort of, the person who solves whatever issue this is. But to truly solve such a complicated issue like homelessness or like public health or climate change or any other of the number of issues that exist, we truly do need to sort of put that selfishness away and deal with the fact that we need to combine our solutions with what works in other cities, other counties, other places that are similar to us. However, one thing that may get lost between all of this, and I want to ask you about this, is the person in general. At the end of the day, when we're trying to solve homelessness, we're trying to make sort of life better or help the circumstances of the person who is homeless. And so, how do you manage when you are a leader, or when putting together leadership teams, to put that person first, to make sure that their dignity and their agency isn't lost in our rush to create solutions to solve an issue that is so complex that exists across our nation?
Yeah, it's such a major, important, critical insight to keep front and center always, right? It's like we're serving people that are really experiencing some of the hardest times of their entire lives. And I think I'm borrowing this from Ian, but there really is, I've found over time, this kind of difference between working in systems and working on systems, right? So, for the beginning of my career, I was really working in systems as a provider. And in many ways, like, those were probably, I mean, every phase of my career has had its highlights and its challenges, but like, I really, really love those days. I mean, the people that I was working with, like when I was like, even like an outreach worker or case manager, like I shouldn't use this term, but it's like, there were people that like, I really loved, like we're really close, and I cared about them, and to see them be successful and get housing and jobs, like it just still, I can like look at pictures of people like getting a job, it still brings like tears to my eyes, honestly, like after all this time. Like, so that was just so powerful. And then working on systems, right, where you kind of move out of that kind of day-to-day of working with people and instead work on systems, in terms of like policy design, working with elected leaders, like it really is fundamentally different. And I think it's easy to, begin to forget about that, right? Like this isn't just like a policy shell game. Like there are actual human beings that are being impacted by this, and I think that's really cannot be forgotten. So, the first thing I would say is, I actually get a lot of people that, reach out to me and, want to like learn about my career. Like they want to like work in homelessness and they want to like jump into these policy roles. Right. And I tell them, it's like, don't do that. Like go work at a shelter, go work in, outreach for a year or two. Like, I really appreciate people that like know what it's like to be in these systems and actually work with people when they're in these crises. Like it's just a fundamentally different learning that I think you carry throughout the rest of your career. So I think that's number one, is like, don't discount, like actually putting in some time and reps of like working directly with folks. And then the second thing I think, working again at the policy level, is that, over the past few years, rightly so, I think this notion of lived experience and getting people's, actual buy-in and feedback about system performance has rightfully been more front and center. I think the issue and challenge, to be frank about it, is how do we not tokenize that? So it just becomes something that is a checkbox of, okay, we did our lived experience surveys, like move on to the next thing. And what I mean by that is, having been a provider and having done lived experience work a lot, there's pretty shockingly consistent feedback about what is and is not working. And it actually goes back to exactly where this conversation started, right? Which is the number one piece of feedback that I hear again and again and again is that our systems are large, confusing, and difficult to navigate. And people hate, understandably, this kind of endless referral cycle where I go to agency A, they refer me to agency B, I have to tell my story again, and then they send me to agency C, and then I have to tell it again. Like, people hate that, understandably. And it's almost like, for maybe like someone in the general public, it's like, imagine going to like 8 therapists, each of whom like gives you an intro interview every time, right? That would be a horrible experience. And you would understandably disengage from that system, right? So when people say, oh, people experiencing homelessness don't want help or they don't want services, that can be why, right? They've been jaded and burned by the system. So in my mind, like, it's kind of taking these fundamental principles or pieces of feedback and actually then using and incorporating them into system design. So you don't have to keep doing this, even though nothing's actually changing.
And you mentioned working on systems, working on the policy, working on the finances of these systems and trying to make them better. So it's not like, you're playing a game of Pong between, different agencies or whatever resources that someone may be looking for. What types of interventions or policies tend to have this impact and tend to make these systems better than they are right now?
Well, I'll give you an example that kind of brings all this together. So after I, worked in Marin, which was about 9 years or so, I had a chance to then do some consulting work in Sonoma County, like I mentioned. So Sonoma County is just north of Marin. So what's interesting is, I had just had that perspective in Marin of, we had this by name list. It was focused on people that were chronically homeless. It drove this major kind of reduction pretty rapidly without other external circumstances changing, right? Because we got more efficient and effective. And so the idea was, how do we scale that to this neighboring community, right? Like, to the question you've been asking, like, how do you spread this innovation? And Marin's point in time count is about 1,000. At that time, Sonoma County's point in time count was about 3,000, though it had been as high as 4 or 5, which would make it one of the biggest continuums of care in the entire country. And what we gradually realized is that the by name list, and I think this is like a really fundamental insight, is that, and why in a lot of cases the by name list breaks down in communities, is that if a by name list gets above about 200 to 250 people, it becomes impossible to actually case conference and use that list to actively help people move into housing, right? So you see that in some communities where they have a by name list of like 1,000 people, and it's like, it's meaningless. Like, it's like, yeah, they have a list. It doesn't do anything, right? So I think that was like the number one thing, right? Is like, in terms of a basic building block, a by name list cannot be larger than 200 to 250 people. And it needs a dedicated project manager who is bringing all those partners together, facilitating conversations and actually driving actions between meetings, which are ideally happening multiple times a week, if, certainly weekly, right? So that's number one. Number two then is, okay, once you have the by name list and that's the basic building block, what happens next in terms of kind of like day-to-day engagement? So this goes back to the lived experience thing we just said, right? People do not like being passed around from different agency to different agency. They want one consistent care relationship. So we said, okay, Sonoma County has about, I think at that time it was like 1,500, 1,600 people that were literally unsheltered. So we said, okay, what if we had a by name list at that size for everyone that's unsheltered, right? So if you kind of add that up, we would need about 6 or 7 or 8 by name lists to cover all unsheltered people, right? Then we said, okay, in order to get around this issue of, passing people around, we're going to have caseload based outreach, right? So outreach is basically just social workers who go out and meet people in unsheltered settings. So we said those folks should have caseloads of no more than 20 to 25 people. And the caseloads are determined by the project manager, right, who knows everyone. So that way everyone is accounted for, everyone's on the list. And when we presented this idea to Sonoma County's Lived Experience Advisory Board, they're like, Yes, this is like the exact thing we want, right? So we moved towards that. And then this was around 2022, 2023. So it's been about 3 years since they began to move and implement this system, which we ended up calling sub-regionalization. And what's happened is that it had an incredible impact, right? So their system referrals for housing, right? So this term coordinated entry is kind of the term that many communities use of having kind of a centralized way of prioritizing their housing placements. That system got 100% more efficient because in the old system, right, these referrals would come up. There was no care relationship. You couldn't find anybody. There was no accountability. And so these housing units would just sit vacant, right? Because you couldn't find the person to fill them. That has gotten 100% more effective since moving to this system. And then secondly, outreach exits in most communities are pretty low, exits to housing, right? So again, you have outreach. They're just kind of giving people water bottles or, forming relationships or whatever. It's not really housing focused. It's not leading to exits. In Sonoma County now, the communities that are really doing the caseload based thing connected to their by name list, they have as high as 75% of people exiting from outreach to permanent housing, right? And in some cases, the average nationally is like 15%, 20%. So that's like triple, quadruple effective, right? So to bring this all together over the last, 3 or 4 years, they have had a 33% overall drop in homelessness, according to their point in time count. They're now sub 2,000, which is really the lowest they've been in over a decade, right? By doing all of these things, right? Learning from others, having a clear accountability structure, creating an ongoing management framework, incorporating lived experience, right? Like, if you bring it all together, it actually works. I think that's really the lesson there.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing to hear that, bringing all of the things we've talked about, like you mentioned, lived experience, sort of centralizing and creating a hierarchy of the people that we need, splitting up the caseload so that they're manageable between people, making sure everyone gets the individual care that they need, and showing that that system works that's truly amazing, and really, really great to see. And that makes you, at least in my eyes, sort of an expert in homelessness. Over a decade in experience, and you've done so much work. I think it's fair to call you that. And you wrote a book, and the book's name was "So You Want to Solve Homelessness? Start Here." And so I want to ask you, what was sort of the reasoning for writing it, and what's the key takeaway from that book? What's it about? And what can it teach others who do want to learn how to solve homelessness?
Yeah, I wrote that book really for no one but myself, honestly. Like, after about, I think I started writing it in 2016, 17. So I'd been working in this space for about 6 or 7 years. And then it took another, 5 years to actually like fully research, write, edit, all that kind of thing. And it really, truly, and I hold to this day, is the book that I wish I had read on day one, right? It's what I wish I had, the orientation that I wish I had to this issue. And it's really kind of broken down in many of the ways that we've sort of, structured even our conversation today, is just really understanding, number one, that this is not inevitable. Like it might feel inevitable. It might, for especially, again, young Americans who've never known a United States without homelessness, it might feel like this is just how it has to be. And it's not. I think that's like the number one takeaway, is that, again, there are these big structural issues, socioeconomic patterns that have been getting worse and worse and worse over the last 40 or 50 years. And if we can address those issues, as big as they are, that will actually fundamentally stop this. So I think that's really number one. And I went into a lot more detail about, what they are and what's driving it. And then the second thing is then also what we're talking about, right? Like if that's problem number one, is fixing the upstream, the other issue is we as a sector can also be more effective as well. And so I sort of go into some of the traditional ways, and I've seen all of this, of like how local communities tend to respond, that actually makes homelessness worse. I think it actually makes it worse in terms of it's slower for people to exit. Again, they disengage from the system and it makes it harder to serve them, right? Like I think we can actually be our own worst enemy in some ways. So I kind of talk about that, right? Like endlessly criminalizing people just for being unsheltered. Like that's not doing anything, right? Or, again, this fragmentation of everyone doing their own thing. I mean, here's like kind of an ironic thing. And you said this earlier so well around innovation, right? It's like, there's this funny tendency where, you can imagine a community, let's say they have 20 different providers, right? But they're not working together. So everyone kind of gets frustrated because the nature of that system is people aren't coordinating and thus the system's not very effective. And so the idea is, well, we just need a new program or initiative, right? And that's going to finally fix this. So then you add a 21st program, then a 22nd organization, right? And ironically, as you add more and more innovation, it actually becomes harder to manage, right? Rather than just bringing everyone together. So I think that's, I kind of go into like how those are actually exacerbating the crisis. And then really, like we've talked about, at the end of the day, it's really about bringing people together in a structured way to really focus on individuals, focus on their unique needs, and really prioritize getting them back inside as fast and effectively as possible. I think it's really that simple, though I don't want to say just because it's a simple strategy, it's easy to execute. But I think that that's the core of it.
I mean, that's truly a great message and definitely something that can be taken away from our conversation as well as your book. I like to sort of conclude these podcasts with a couple of sort of quick rapid fire, more of thinking in the future type questions. And the first one I have is, what do you think is the most important, or maybe the top 3 most important changes that need to be made within the next 5 to 10 years for us to see drastic improvements in how we deal with homelessness?
I think we're in this really interesting moment right now. It's 2026, and this might sound a little bit funny, but in some ways, I almost view this as perhaps the lowest moment in the history of the response to modern homelessness, right? I mean, in many ways, I think the homeless service sector has kind of lost the public's trust that our way of solving this is the way to solve it. Also you see with the Supreme Court and sort of the criminalization of people being unsheltered, there's that. And then there's been so many threats and cuts to funding, right? I mean, I think fortunately, as of the recording of this podcast, the federal government and I think Congress really came through to preserve a lot of the federal funding for homelessness. But ironically, in a quote unquote progressive state like California, they've axed ongoing homelessness funding, right? So I think that deserves a little more, scrutiny around what's going on there. So in many ways, again, loss of public faith, changing legal frameworks that I think further harm people, and then erosion of funding. It's like things are really kind of awful right now, right? And so ironically, and it's weird because again, things are so in many ways bleak. I actually almost feel more hopeful and optimistic, almost in the way that I felt when I first started 16 years ago with AmeriCorps, of this is really a moment, if we utilize it, to really come together and do a lot of the things that we've talked about. And you've said, like, I think very well, right? Of like really stopping, taking a breath, and looking around the country and saying, okay, the communities that are really making progress, what are they doing? What is the structure of their programs? How are they actually designing it? Like, if we can really come together and build that coordination alignment that has not really been an inherent part of our response to date, it's going to take a couple years. Like, it's not going to happen overnight. But if we can get strategic and more aligned and create those kind of organization frameworks now, then when the pendulum begins to swing, because it always swings, then we're going to be in an incredible position to capitalize on, more goodwill, a different political environment, a different funding environment, and to just really, light into the future, right? But it's also possible that that doesn't happen and that things get worse. And, it really becomes almost irreversible. Like, I think that I don't want to rule that out, but to me, it's an incredible moment to kind of get more strategic and then stick with that strategy, for the next 5, 6, 7 years, like a simple strategy we can all get behind.
And for the next generation who is going to have to take over and, sort of lead the charge in these next couple of years and be ready for when the pendulum swings, what's your message for people who are aspiring social entrepreneurs within the field of homelessness?
I would even say, first of all, amazing. Like if that's who you are and you're listening, like keep at it. I mean, oh my gosh, we need you. And I'm glad you're part of the movement. And I would also just say, I think there is just this deeper issue in our country right now, in our culture right now, where um, we're just there's so much polarization, there's so much kind of fighting. Like I just feel like, as a country, like we just feel like we're kind of unraveling in some way. And I'll say, if I could, had my one magic wish of what to do, one of them would be AmeriCorps. For me was life changing, right? Like if I hadn't had the chance to do that, to have a role in national service, like that sparked all of this in so many ways. And so I think this idea in time, like if we as a country really could have people, at scale taking gap years or doing something where they're actually, leaving New York City and going to, Kansas, and people in Kansas going to the Bay Area, and people in the Bay Area going to, Montana or whatever, working on public service projects and really understanding these complex issues firsthand on the ground directly. I think in a matter of, 5, 10, 15 years, like that would fundamentally restructure the culture of our country such that, we have this kind of common experience of service, and people would just really see these issues as things that we can solve, right? Like we put people on the moon, we can solve poverty and homeless. Like I believe that fundamentally, right? So I think that would be the big goal, is just, finding ways to be of service, even if it's just for, a year or something like that. I think it makes a huge difference.
A centralization, unification of everyone around the country involved in this issue, and also the solutions that we've used that are similar and that can work. That's definitely one of the major takeaways from this episode. Thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew. I really appreciated your time and for you sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you again.